Great, thank you so much, and welcome everyone. It's so interesting with all the changes on the platform, especially with the big move to Lightning, that some of the things we're going to talk about today are actually on the older side within Salesforce, but still very valuable. If you need to reach me during or after, you can reach me via my email address. It's dcarnes@opfocus.com. I'm also fairly active on Twitter. I try to tweet about Salesforce reports and dashboards every day. I tend to speak a lot about that topic, and my Twitter hashtag is DavidPCarnes3. All right, let's get started. So what I thought to talk about is how to plan for making changes to your sales stages. Feature selection. There are quite a number of features we can choose from. Some of us overdo it, and our sales reps hate us for it. But we can talk about those. Then I want to share just a couple thoughts around how to make the change. Some of us have smaller instances of Salesforce. We might not be as familiar with using SANDBOXES, so I want to talk about that. And then finally, getting ready for the migration and pulling the trigger on the migration. And then we've left some time for questions. All right, let's talk about planning. So when a carpenter buddy of mine offered to build OpFocus's first office in the basement of one of our prior homes. During that couple of weeks we spent together putting up 2x4s and hanging sheetrock, I heard more expressions about carpentry, and one of them was measure twice, cut once. And it's funny, it's just stuck with me all these years. And I think of that in terms of planning. So, when we think about making changes in a system like Salesforce, especially for those of you, and those of you that have registered for today have significant numbers of users within your instances, it can be a pretty significant change. So some of the reasons why we make changes to these: you might have a new CRO. One of the 3 software companies that I had worked for earlier in my career, I had 5 VPs of sales in 4 years, and each one came in with a new methodology. So I got to build out every methodology possible at that point. But you also might decide to implement a new methodology. There might be additional products through an acquisition. It might be a change in strategy. Often we're asked, especially with SaaS companies, to help build out a customer success program and have a different sales methodology for renewal. So that's an important consideration, and it's the example that I'll use today. Some of the impact of making these changes, certainly to stages and to overall process, but also other things to keep in mind are automation. So you may already have workflow rules, process builder processes, approval processes. You might have Apex code that's triggered based on stage changes. And you want to think about those things prior to swapping out stages. Also, it's important to think of the impact on reporting. And then specifically with report filters, how information is displayed. Also, if you use filters on the opportunity tab for list views, there may be an impact to that. So we see the impact in a number of places when making these changes. When I think about moving processes, what I usually will do is take a spreadsheet and list out the old stages. We'll spend some time. Often we want to lock the door, shut off the lights, shut off the phones, and just focus for a couple of hours to come up with a compelling set of stages. At the sales summit, the sales ops summit a couple months back, it was really great to hear Pablo and Nalini talk about customer or prospect driven milestones, which help define stages. So if you're going to move stage to stage, I really like this idea that it be driven by actions taken by the customer rather than actions taken by your sales reps. So what I have here is I have 2 different sales processes. When you buy Salesforce, there's one. I think it's an old Miller-Hyman process, but it doesn't seem to fit anybody. So in this case, you see the left-hand column, I've defined new stages, and the top set are for new business sales, so for prospects. And then down below, I've got our renewal sales process. And I'm not at all advocating these particular stage names. It's more just to give you an example. So once you've defined your stages, you definitely want to define a mapping. So all the old data in the system, all of the old opportunities, we want to map those to the new stage values. With this pick list in particular, it's a special pick list in Salesforce. There are a handful of other fields that must be defined. So one of them is the type field. And this is an important one. Anytime I create a list view filter or a report filter on an opportunity, and if I'm doing something based on whether a deal is open or not, so if I'm trying to pull a list of open pipe, I will filter on this type field. And what Salesforce has is a couple of system-generated formulas, and it's either closed or not, and it's either won or not, and you can filter on that. And that way, if your stages change again in a year, you don't actually have to update all those filters if you base it off of that, the closed field and the won field. When you define each stage, you're also specifying a probability to close. My suggestion for this is to use it as, will this deal ever close? And if so, how likely is it to close? So for our targeting stage, we might say 0% or 10%. For our contracts, we might aim for 90%. But the reality is in your past history of selling, these are only defaults. What you can do is, as the deals move stage to stage, your sales reps can react to the new default percentage and lower it or increase it as they see fit. Similarly, when we define stages, we define forecast categories. These three choices, pipeline, best case, and commit, have been around since the beginning of time, it seems. Probably about 10 years ago, maybe 7 years ago, Salesforce actually allowed us to overwrite these values. One of the VPs of sales for a SaaS company we work with loved golf and used closest to the pin and things like that for commitment level for the reps, and it was sort of fun in a way. So you can't add new categories, but you can relabel the existing pipeline, best case, and commit if you wish. One other thing that we like to recommend is that you have a good, clear definition for each stage, what the reps are expected to do, and that the stages actually be milestone driven. Some of these milestones might end up as fields on the opportunity, and you might decide to require those fields. So this is just a sample. I find it helpful to just lay this out to get agreement across departments. Oftentimes, a head of marketing may not agree with the head of sales and so on about what the stages should be. But this is a pretty fundamental step to map these out. All right, so once we've mapped these sales stages out and we've defined our milestones and helpful fields and that sort of thing, what we might want to talk about now is which of the features within Salesforce to help us reinforce that methodology do we want to choose. So some of the features out there are obviously the stages. There's another feature called sales process or sales processes. It doesn't really see the light of day. It's only used for one very specific thing, and that's to support the next thing on the list, which is record types. So we'll talk about record types. This is the part in the old version of the Wizard of Oz where it goes from black and white to color. Suddenly, when you introduce record types into a system, you can suddenly handle more things. It's just like it goes from 2D to 3D. It's suddenly from one way of doing things, now we have multiple ways. In a nutshell, record types are how we could have a whole pile of sales processes. One of the companies we worked with years ago up in the Boston area was iRobot. It was so interesting because they sold to the military, and there were $50 million robots that they sold for mine detection and stuff. And there might be a 2-year sales process for that to sell to the military, whereas if you were buying the Roomba, there might be 3 sales stages, and it's all sold through the channel. We could have totally different sets of stages, and that was helped by record types. So we'll talk about custom fields, field dependencies, validation rules, path, and celebrations. Celebrations is probably the newest feature on this list that just came out a few weeks ago in the summer release. We'll talk about approval processes, which have been around forever, and then the new Lightning lead conversion page as well. So what we see over here on the left-hand side is just a typical opportunity in Lightning. You have a highlights panel across the top. And then what I have exposed here is what's called the path. And the path allows you to see chevrons across the opportunity. We can see each of the stages. We can interact with the chevron values. If you've set up path in a particular way, you can also expand this section and you can see key fields for that stage. And you can also put in guidance for success. I obviously wimped out and put in lorem ipsum dolor because I just couldn't think of something specific to put in there. But all right, let's take a look. So for sales stages, this is really the core of what we're here talking about. And what we can see in this screenshot is these are the out-of-the-box basic set of stages that Salesforce provides. You can see the stage name. You can see the order of the stages. This order is important. You do not want to have stages out of order when you do sorting on a report or on a dashboard. The stage names are important. Separately here, you see the definition of whether this stage is open or not. I would not fool around with these. I just make them correct. So in our example, we'll go in and we'll add a new value called dead. And when we add the value called dead, we'll make it a closed lost value. We'll set the default probability to 0, and we'll set the default forecast category to omitted. So each of these columns is important. You want to think about each one of them. So let's actually go do that example in the system. So I have a system set up here. Just this is a dev org with some extra reporting capabilities set up in it. I've just had some fun putting a dashboard panel and whatnot, some things on the home page. If you're not familiar with this interface, this is Salesforce Lightning. It's coming up on its 4th anniversary, so it's not new. It certainly hasn't been ready for 4 years, but I feel like it's very ready now for most use cases. In fact, it's really quite great to work with. So if we were to go behind the scenes and click on Setup, we come to the back end of the system. Normally we're brought under the home part of Setup. I've already clicked on Object Manager and I've selected the Opportunity object. And this is where we can see some of the opportunity structural elements. We can see the list of fields and relationships. And I've clicked on that and I've just selected the stage field. So this is that page we were just looking at. And one of the decisions that you'll need to make is what do you want to add in this list of values. Typically what we'll do is we'll back up all of the open opportunities or back up all the opportunities. And then when we want to make changes to this based on our plan, because of course we're all planning before we do this, we'll come in and we'll just add new values. And you can see here that I had my basic set of stages from before, and I've added new values here. And this is for the 2 different sales processes that I'll have for new business and for the renewal business. And if I want to add a new value, let's go ahead and add a value for dead. So what I can do here is click new, and you may say, why on earth is he adding a value for dead? Not trying to be funny. You know, it's really interesting. Sales reps don't like to say they lost something. And so when you add a value, a stage value, you need to define the type. And again, this drives a couple of very important system generated formula fields. Closed, and also one that you can use in filtering. So I'm going to make this one closed lost, probability of 0, and the forecast category is automatically set to omitted when I choose closed lost. If you write a description here, it's great. Nobody can see it, so it's not all that useful. And then down below, because I've already created sales processes, we'll talk about these in a minute. Because I've already created them, I can go ahead and add just by checking, and I'll add it to 2 different, the renewal and the new sales process. So I'll go ahead and click Save. All right, so we've just added a new opportunity stage. Luckily, this one's already in the correct position. If it wasn't, I could click on the reorder button. It's very easy to move them up and down. A couple of the other things to point out here, when you make your changes to the stages, you have 2 options. You can delete a value or you can deactivate a value. Deactivating a value just drops it down in an inactive value list. The data is still in your system. So you haven't actually changed any of the existing records. Many of us, when we do make a change like this, we actually want to map all of our old values and the existing open opportunities to the new values. So if I go back to my planning screenshot here, we can see the old stage and we want to map them to the new stages. So if I decide to do that, what I might do is if I want to map needs analysis and I want to map that to qualified, which is one of my new stages, what I can do is I can delete needs analysis and it says, are you sure? And when you do this, it says, what do you want to replace this with? And I'll just replace it with my new qualified value. So when I've done that, it didn't add it down to the inactive values below. So to finish this exercise, I actually need to go through and do the same step for all of my open opportunities. I'm sorry, all these existing stages just to get them out of the list. So either delete them or deactivate them. Again, before doing any of this, we want to back up all the data just so you have a copy of it. So I'll just go through, and so value proposition was going to educate, so I'll click OK, flip that to educate, and so on. ID decision makers was going to validate. I tend to not keep around the old ones. It just feels like boxes in the attic to me to see the inactive values. There might be a reason to keep them if you need that data in your system for much, if you want to see those old values for some reason. But we just have 3 more. If I wanted to deactivate one, I'll show you that. If I deactivate perception analysis, it literally is just no longer a choice in the list, but the data did not move. So I still have old values sitting there. So actually, why don't I just complete this? It doesn't feel completed to me because I've been deactivating and I haven't moved the data. Why don't I do the last ones? I'll delete this one. Probably normally I do them all the same way, but just to show you both. Great. Okay, so that's updating your stages, so pretty simple. I mentioned here that we have a reorder button. You also have another special tool, and this is true for all pick lists. You have reorder and replace. And this just allows you to say, hey, what's the old value, what's the new value, and just run right through them. Another little option here is printable view. I find that really helpful just to get a list, a text list that I can copy and paste and stick somewhere else. Perhaps if I'm doing reporting in a BI tool or something and I just want to grab that full list. All right, so we've updated these. Let's actually talk about a couple of other features. So one of them is sales processes, and this you may not ever use unless you want to introduce record types. So you cannot create a record type until you've created a sales process. There is no mystery here. This is just a bucket of sales stages. That's all it is. So if you think of a sales process as a set of stages, that's it. And what you do is you create all your new stages. They become available values. Then you select the ones that you want as part of that sales process. So pretty simple. We find these also under setup. So they are not under the opportunity section. But if I come up here and I type in processes, I can see it's under feature settings and under sales processes. I've already gone ahead and created them, but they're very simple to create. You click new, give it a name, and then you specify which stages should be included. Let's just double check both of these. So this is the name. The description is not visible to users, and then it can be active or not. So if I want to go update the values, just click on the label, and I can see that pending and engaged are not included here. So let's double check that against our list here. So pending and engaged, contracts, closed won. So we really only have 3 open stages for our renewal. So I'll just make sure, and those ones should not be part of the list. It looks like the list is in nice order. The only way to change the order of these is actually to go back to stages and use the reorder button. We're not able to do it here. I didn't make any changes, so I'll just click cancel on this one. We'll take a peek at the renewal sales process. And I have pending, engaged, contracts, closed won, closed lost, dead. Great, so this one's all set as well. What that allows us to do is immediately talk about our next topic, which is record types. So I mentioned earlier, this is where Salesforce starts to get interesting. You can have as many record types as you need. I've seen 20 on a single object. I haven't bothered to see if we can do more than that, but I don't think it would be a problem. 20 would be a lot. What record types allow us to do is determine which page layout is shown. So in this example, you might have a new sales process, page layout, opportunity layout, and you might have a separate one just for renewals. Record types also determine which bucket of stages or which sales process is used. Record types also can give us shorter lists of pick lists if we want. So let's say on an account, if you have a particular record type and you want the industry pick list to only show 5 values, so based on that record type, we can restrict the list of pick list values shown. When you create a record type, this is a significant thing in the system. These are assigned by profile. So if I had a client success team and those were only the people that were able to create new opportunities that were renewals, I'd have to create the record types and then go to their profile, their security profile, and give them access to create records of that record type. What we see on the screenshot over here on the left is we have the 2 record types created. It's very simple to create the record types. They're just a couple of steps. If I go back to the object manager, and I scroll through my objects. This is one of the big changes in Lightning, that we have all of our custom and our standard objects all mixed together, nicely alphabetized. But if I go back to the opportunity object here under Object Manager, I can see my list of record types here. I've gone ahead and created these already just to have like a Julia Childs with the pot boiling already. But what you see here is a label. This label is seen by users. This description is absolutely seen by users. And then finally, we see that it's active. So these ones are actually in place. I'll just show you the new screen so you see what happens when you create a new record type. First thing is you give it a name. So let's say that we were selling to the military and that was our new type of record that we wanted to create. We would have already had to have created a sales process. So let's say I'm just going to reuse this one. We must give it a description, otherwise an end user would just see an empty box. And then finally, you can have a record type that's active or inactive. When you create the record type, one of the steps that's interesting is that you can specify whether it's enabled and also whether it's set as default. If you set this record type as default for a particular profile, every time that user goes and creates an opportunity, this will be the default type, whatever type, this military type, for example. All right, so that's record types. Again, they determine page layouts that are shown, which set of stages are shown, and then they can also impact pick lists. It's quite common to create custom fields. For those of you with the Enterprise Edition, you can have 500 custom fields on opportunities. There are 22 data types available. My suggestion would be to think through your sales process stages and then determine if any additional fields that don't come out of the box are required. We might want to have a budget confirmation field, an acknowledgement from the customer or the prospect that they have budget. We might also have another field where we've established the timeline. So those are two examples. If you have the unlimited edition of Salesforce, you can actually have 800 custom fields per object. This is how we build out sales methodology, and quite often we're adding 100 fields or more to support a variation of a sales methodology. Once we create custom fields, another common thing to do is to create field dependencies. A nice example of one you can see right here with the stage is changed to closed one. This reason field wakes up. I've also made that field required on the page layout. So it's not required for the other stages, but as soon as it's one, and we can see here in the example when you set up the field dependency, if it's won or lost, it should show these reasons. I tend to use a single field for reason and use it for both won and lost. What's funny is if you put sales execution as a reason, nobody seems to select it for lost deals. They never seem to admit that. But what you do is you select a controlling field, and that could be a checkbox or a pick list. Then you select a dependent field, and that could be a pick list or a multi-select, and basically you connect those two fields. So I'll show you the one I have set up in the system. So if we go under Setup, Opportunity, under the Object Manager, and if I click on Field Dependencies, I can see I have one created. The controlling field is Stage, which is a pick list. The dependent field is Reason, which is also a pick list. And if I go to edit that, I'm brought to this sort of ancient looking grid. And if I scroll over, I actually have a new choice here that I want to update. And this actually brings up an important point. If you use field dependencies and you add new pick list values, you have to come back and edit the field dependency to be able to use them. So if I click Next here, I'm going to go ahead and select all of these. These could die from price, relationship, sales execution, expertise, timing, and political shifts. So I think those are all valid. I'll click Include Values, and I'll click Save. So that field is now updated, and it works as it's shown here. If the stage is changed to closed, lost, closed won, or dead, then the field wakes up. Great. So a couple of other tools that we use. One of them is validation rules. This is the fastest way to break your system. I remember when these were first released, we had companies left and right calling in, complaining. Our admin just went on vacation for a week and he scurried and got a bunch of stuff done, and now we can't save opportunities. Help. And so you literally can break your system and just stop it from saving anything with this. When you create a validation rule, what you do is you go under Setup, and it's right here under the same Object Manager. You create them for each object. So you have a list of validation rules here. When you create one, you give it a name. Beware, these are active by default. I've unchecked the active checkbox, but you only want to turn this on once you've tested it My preference would be that you test it in a sandbox first. Most rookie validation writers get it wrong. The true value is the bad value. That's the one that stops data from being saved. And we show an error message. Most people get that the other way around. But what you do is you define the name, description, you write a formula. The formula is a Boolean formula, and this results true or false. If it's true, show the error message. That's bad. Do not allow the save. If it's false, that's good. Don't show an error message. Allow the record to be saved. So in this case, I'm basically saying if the deal is open and it's not a prospecting deal, but if it's qualified, educate, validate, et cetera, if it's one of the open ones or it's closed, and if the budget is not confirmed, that's bad, show an error message. And we can show the error message up at the top of the page, or we can show it down at the field. So what you see here is it says, when I try to save this, it says review the errors on the page, and down by that checkbox field. So these can literally drive salespeople crazy. I'm sure some of you are laughing on the webinar right now. Because if you add too many of them, it can literally take a half an hour for somebody to close their opportunity because they just keep getting caught field after field. All right, a couple of other things here. Path is newer, and this has had a couple of updates over time. So once you've built out, you've added your sales processes, you've added your record types now, and you've added all your custom fields, now we can create one or more path. And the path is something that we can put onto the page layout. And you can see here the chevrons that appear across the screen. If you have defined key fields for each stage and or guidance for success, the caret appears and we can expand and collapse that section. Behind the scenes, what we do is we go under Setup, Feature Settings, and we go into Path, and we can enable the path. Once you enable the path, you choose which set of stages am I going to create the path for, and you literally go through stage by stage and add fields, if you wish, that appear in the key field section, and also guidance for success, stage by stage. So this is really kind of a nice feature. I think it looks great. There are another couple of options. You can determine when you put the path on a page layout whether you want there are I think 3 options for how the path appears and whether you want this big button over here on the right. If you have a lot of sales stages, you may not want that to appear. Another thing in this particular case is that you see checkboxes as the stages are completed. One of the other options when you create the page is to not put checkbox to actually show the stages. This is a really nice argument for not having very long stage names because they sort of look funny and they'd be truncated with the path. One of the other nice things about the path is celebrations. So this is very quirky. People seem to love it. And this is the last step of setting up the path that you can determine. It's a little toggle if you want to have confetti appear on the screen. What's really quirky about this is that you can choose multiple pick list values. Yes, we've qualified the deal. You could show confetti. The default is that it rarely shows, and I don't quite understand that. Maybe for an environment that's transactional and has deals closing constantly, you wouldn't want the confetti. But you know, if a rep isn't closing a deal every day, maybe the confetti is nice, and you can switch it to always. This is what the confetti looks like over here. I'm going to see if it'll work on the webinar. I've got this all set up here, another org that I'm in. So if I go in this org and click on closed, and then select that as the stage, and make it closed one, let's see if the confetti appears. There it is. Yay. Okay, yay. So we have stars and there's hearts and streamers and stuff like that. So that was pretty remarkable. But it's just sort of a fun little quirky thing that just came out this summer and people seem to like it. It's celebrations. All right, the last 2 things I want to talk about, these are also not new, but approval processes. This is starting to get into the deeper end of the pool within Salesforce. Admins, a lot of admins have never even worked with these, but this is a way to automate approvals. These are complex, these are powerful. When somebody submits something for approval, we can lock the record. We can define all sorts of complexity around who's the next approver. You can have 30 steps. Please don't do that, that's too many. It would take days to test something with 30 steps, but I sort of feel like they did what, they asked the question, what would NASA need? And they built that. But why I mention these is that we can automate stages. So we could automate a move from a stage to a stage. We can also send notifications. a company that will remain nameless that was bought by Salesforce for a couple billion, a SaaS company that we worked with for about 7 years. They had asked us to build out 3 approval processes on opportunities. So you can have more than one. To say that an opportunity was qualified, we had an approval process. A manager had to lean in and agree. To say that that a discount was allowed required an approval. To say that the deal was dead required an approval. It's really quite something, but I think maybe that worked out well for them. The last thing I'll show is lead conversion settings. A lot of people don't realize that lead conversion is quite nice and quite different in Lightning. In my opinion, the lead conversion page was the worst page in Classic for over a decade, just a terrible, terrible page. In Lightning, it looks quite nice. It's got some new features, and this is why you might come under Setup, Feature Settings, Marketing, and update the lead settings. So a couple to point out. One is require validation for converted leads. If you don't want, when somebody converts a lead, if you don't want all those validation rules to fire, you can turn it off. That might prevent somebody from converting a lead, which might be a good thing. Another one here that's not on by default is to enable conversions for Salesforce Mobile. If your reps are out in the field, you want to move deals along faster, you might allow them to actually convert a lead on the mobile. I don't know why that's not on. Another one that's interesting here for B2B companies is we can specify that an opportunity is not created by default. I like that. A lot of us will have 10 people from one company show up on a webinar. That doesn't mean there are 10 opportunities. There's probably one opportunity, but we have 10 leads we might want to convert into contacts. So if we were to check that, the default would be to not create an opportunity. I do have one more screenshot here, which is what that lead conversion page looks like. And it's quite nice. So you've got 3 sections: account, contact, and opportunity. And depending on some of those settings, controls what we see here. What we also have on the right-hand side are duplicate rules. These rules have to be activated in your system. A lot of us have just sort of ignored them over the years. But if you want an existing lead to appear, Sam Sneed, and if you want to catch that there might be a duplicate, you actually have to turn on the duplicate rules. This is one of those things that I'd want to train users on once I go in and update the settings, just teach people how to convert a lead properly. It sounds funny, but a lot of organizations have sort of useless opportunities created because the default is to always create an opportunity. I really dislike that. All right, so let's talk about a sandbox. Each of you has at least 26 sandboxes. So if you're on Enterprise Edition or on Unlimited Edition, there are 4 kinds of sandboxes. So for years and years, most of us just had one, a developer sandbox. A developer sandbox has no data in it. Each of us were given a partial sandbox, which contains a smattering of data. And it's kind of sort of a nice way to try out your migration to Lightning. You can also use a partial or a developer, but to test out sales stage changes. Depending on the type of sandbox, most of them you can refresh weekly. For a full sandbox, you can refresh them monthly. A couple things to know about using a sandbox. The only way to log in is using test.salesforce.com. If you go under Setup, under New Environments, Sandboxes, you can also see the login link here, and you can get in that same way. It just goes to test.salesforce.com. When you create a sandbox, you give it a name. So this one here is literally just called dev, D-E-V. And to log into that, I'd go to test.salesforce.com, use my username, dcarnes@opfocus.com.dev. And that's how you get in. The one other thing to note when working with a sandbox is if it was last refreshed a year ago, you may need to use your password from a year ago to get into that sandbox. All right, so let's talk about the migration. I said before, I really want you to back up data before you do any of this. You've got a couple of options. One of them is to use the data loader. It's very simple. You have to download the data loader. In fact, it's harder to install the data loader than it is to use the data loader. And any admin can do this, but if they click on export, log in, you choose opportunities, and then I would just click the box here to select all fields. It just writes a SQL query, and then you click finish, and it just spits out. If you have 1,000 opportunities, it's a CSV file with all the columns and those 1,000 opportunities. Another option to do a backup would be an export. Just create a report, export it, try to include as many meaningful columns as you can. The data loader is pretty easy. All right, so when you go to make the change, again, I would do this in a sandbox. I would back up your data. I'd go through the update of the stages. So I had mentioned in here before, if we look at the fields and relationships and go down to the stage field, you're going to want to add your new values, put them in the order that you want, and you're going to want to either delete or deactivate the old values. If you delete them, it includes a mapping step. If you deactivate them, you still may want to map them. So let's say I want to map the ones in prospecting. I can do that with the replace button up here. When I click the replace button, it says exchange the value changing from. You saw that I copied it and pasted it so I wouldn't type it wrong. And then I'm going to make this one, I'm going to map it to targeted. And so it's going to take a minute for that to run. If I go back to my previous work here, the value stays in the inactive list, but those values have been changed to targeted now. So you basically go through each of your stages. Please, please, please back up before you do any of this. Okay, so what else? So you might, once you've updated the stages, go ahead and create your sales processes. You might define record types from there. It would make no sense whatsoever to create a sales process without a record type. Those go hand in hand. You might create custom fields. You might create field dependencies. You might create validation rules. Validation rules require somebody to write a Boolean formula. If you're not sure what that is, there are badges on Trailhead. You might also ask somebody who's comfortable writing formulas. The true version is that the true result is the bad result. That's when we show the error message. You might also look at approval processes. You might set up a path, update page layouts. In Lightning, we have some really nice options for controlling the page layouts. You might look to update your lead conversion settings. And then finally, test again. So I would do all these steps in the sandbox, make sure it looks good, make sure that things work correctly. And then on the day that you move to production, I would say, don't do this on the last day of the quarter. I would say don't do it when business users are in the system. Frankly, it'd just be confusing to them. I would probably host a training afterward as well, just to walk people through what the new process is. So the last thing to show you here is I have access to both record types. And if you haven't used record types before, one of the things that can be confusing is when you go to create a new opportunity, I'm given the opportunity because I have the ability, my profile allows me to select both record types. I can see both, and here's the description here. This is why I said earlier you should really include a description. But if I choose renewals and then click next, what I'm going to get are those, I'm going to get the page layout that's specific for a renewal opportunity. I'm going to get the renewal set of stages. So we defined pending, engaged, and contracts. So not the full set because it's renewals. And then any other pick list values, such as this one called reason. This is the reason dependency. This is not available to me until I select closed won, lost, or dead. So if I select dead, you see that it wakes up, and it's also required when it wakes up because I made it required on the page layout. I had that validation rule. It was related to this field called budget confirmed. If I were to select this and try to save it for any of these middle stages, it wouldn't allow me to, unless, I'm sorry, if I tried to save it one of those stages and didn't have the budget confirmed, it wouldn't allow me to save it. I'd get the error message. All right, great. So why don't we take a few minutes for questions?
That would be great. If anyone has a question, now's the time to enter into the side panel. Great to see that we already have one come in. So David, how do changes in stages impact report and view filters?
Oh, great question. So this is one of those things you want to think about, and you want to think about it long before you make your stage changes. So the default for people is they think in terms of filtering on stage names. As I've seen over many, many years of doing this, that the stage names come and go. Frankly, I don't even care what methodology you use at this point. I just want you to have a methodology, and I want it to be milestone driven. But if you do your filtering on list views and on reports, if you do it on stage names, you're risking those names not being valid after a while. A lot of us need to report on open pipe, closed won business, and maybe closed dead business or lost business. So if you use those fields correctly, so I showed them earlier when you're defining the stage here, if you set these types correctly, it just automatically works. The closed field can be used to say closed equals false for open deals, and there's a one field if it's true that shows one deals only. So we can use those two fields. You just want to be careful of that with the pick list values. So that's a great question.
Awesome. And where else can we use path in Salesforce?
Oh, that's a really good question. So path is not just for opportunity stages. So we saw that back in here, and I'll just go to an existing opportunity. If I click on this opportunity, this set of chevrons here is the path. Depending on the stage, we might have other fields that are visible. We can see the key fields, etc. This can be used on accounts. A lot of you are doing account-based marketing. We could have a pick list field called the ABM status. We might have targeted, engaged, landed, expand, or something like that maybe. And you could have this chevron across all of your accounts. You could use it on leads, you can use it on campaigns, you can use it on custom objects. So we can use it pretty much throughout the system.
Wonderful. Great, and we only have a minute left, so if anyone else remaining has a question, feel free to enter it now. Otherwise, we will be sharing this recording with everyone by the end of the day. So keep a lookout for an email from me. And also, as always, please enter your questions, whether it's feedback from today's webinar or remaining things that you would like to learn, or questions you'd like to either ask David directly and we'll provide his contact information, or you want Pablo and the sales COE to answer. Do so on the Go Network and we'll be sure to connect you. Well, thank you everyone. Keep a lookout for that email and we'll talk soon and hope to see you at the next one.